Early 2000s America was a special time for cars. Not only did we get the Subaru WRX STI and the Lancer Evo 8, but BMW gave us the S54-powered E46 M3, VW dropped the elusive R32, and Chevy rolled out the extremely capable C6 Corvette. Peak Corvette, in my opinion. And of course, we got some very interesting designs from Chrysler, like the Hemi-powered Dodge Magnum station wagon. But in early 2004, at the Detroit International Auto Show, Ford revealed the one I like the most, the 5th generation retro-inspired Mustang, codenamed the S197. Its design obviously borrowed heavily from the iconic Mustangs of the 1960s, and kicked off something of a retro renaissance as Dodge and Chevy followed suit by reintroducing the Challenger in 2009 and the Camaro in 2010. The GT version came with a 300 horsepower 4.6-liter 3-valve V8 that enabled it to get to 60 miles per hour in just over 5 seconds, which actually made it one of the quickest new cars in 2005 under $30,000. And it was even faster than your personal favorite, the Neon SRT4. But by today's standards, these aging S197 Mustangs are neither fast nor are they a great platform to build on, as they have brittle connecting rods and weak transmissions, relegating them to the entry-level performance corner of the market at best. But I've never really cared much about that because I like these cars and have been transforming my 2007 Mustang GT ever since I picked it up years ago. It all started with basic bro mods like an intake and a Bama tune, but eventually progressed to rebuilding the engine with stronger internals and swapping in the mother of manual transmissions, the T56 Magnum XL. And today, we're going to give this Mustang its biggest upgrade yet, a centrifugal supercharger system from Vortech that includes their V3 Ti self-lubricating head unit that's good for over 950 horsepower. We'll also be upgrading the radiator and fuel system to ensure this Mustang can keep its cool and supply enough fuel to feed its blown V8. Then we'll head over to Street to Sand to recalibrate the Mustang's tune and find out how much power this cammed and stroked Mustang can put down with a little boost. Then finally, we'll race a 2015 Dodge Viper with a 645 horsepower 8.4-liter V10 to see if we've done enough for the Mustang to hang with the most powerful production Viper ever built. So if you like boosting engines, learning about tuning, racing badass cars, and are someone with an attention span longer than a TikTok video, you've come to the right place. The first step on our journey to Boostland is to remove the intake. So we pull off the driver's side PCV tube, remove the 2 bolts that hold the intake to the fender apron, disconnect the mass airflow sensor, and loosen the clamp holding the intake elbow to the throttle body. This allows us to wiggle the intake loose and pull it from the engine. Next, we disconnect the throttle body connections, release the fuel rails from the manifold, and remove the fuel injectors, which will get cleaned later. Then we can remove the 10 bolts holding the intake manifold to the cylinder heads and pull it from the engine. As you can see, the area around the intake ports is pretty grimy, so we're going to take a moment to clean up the cylinder heads with a little brake cleaner. We'll also use an extension claw holding some paper towel soaked in brake cleaner to remove buildup from the walls of the intake runners. Then we'll tape off the ports to ensure you don't drop anything down them. Now, since we'll be installing this upgraded radiator from Mishimoto, we're going to lift the car with this handy quick jack and also remove the front bumper, which luckily isn't too difficult on these cars. With the car raised, we can easily access and remove the 19mm plug on the radiator to let the coolant drain out. Then we'll remove the radiator cover, coolant reservoir, and upper radiator hose. And since we need to relocate the power steering reservoir to make room for the supercharger, we'll go ahead and remove that as well. Next, we disconnect the fan's electrical connector and remove the 2 bolts holding it to the radiator so we can pull the fan shroud from the engine bay. From under the car, we release the lower radiator hose clamp and pull the hose off. Then we remove the 2 nuts holding the AC condenser to the radiator. And finally, we unbolt the 2 hold-down brackets, allowing us to lift the radiator up and out of the engine bay. Now, this Mustang has an aftermarket crankshaft pulley that's smaller than the original, also known as an Underdrive pulley. This means all the pulleys you see here spin slower than stock. This reduces drag on the engine, which allows more horsepower to get to the wheels. But we don't want to underdrive our supercharger, as that would result in less boost, so we have to take an extra step here and reinstall the stock crank and water pulleys. With the transmission in gear and the parking brake engaged, we use an 18mm socket and a breaker bar to loosen the crank bolt, followed by a right angle impact to quickly remove the bolt. The water pulley is a little trickier to remove as it tends to spin when loosening its bolts, so hold it in place with your opposite hand. Once one of the bolts is out, rotate the tensioner so you can remove the serpentine belt, then stick a screwdriver through the water pulley to prevent it from rotating as you remove the remaining bolts. Usually a puller is required to get a damper off a crankshaft, but sometimes you can get away with a couple screwdrivers. Now, to accommodate the supercharger bracket, we have to make a few modifications to the hardware on the front driver's side area of the engine, starting with this stud that supports the alternator. We'll use an extractor socket to pull pull it out since there's not enough thread to use the double nut method. Next, we remove the 13mm bolt to the right of the stud we just removed and the nut that holds the suppression capacitor in place. We also need to cut off this stud to make room for the supercharger pulley, along with this tab on the valve cover to ensure the serpentine belt has a clear path. After cleaning up our mess, it's finally time to start putting parts back on the engine, starting with the stock crank pulley, something I like to call the Cramper. We apply some RTV to the Cramper's keyway and the crank bolt washer to prevent oil leaks. Now, I had a tough time getting the Cramper onto the nose of the crankshaft, so I baked it in the oven at 220 degrees for about a half hour to expand the bore, and also added a bit of oil to it. This allowed me to pretty easily work the Cramper onto the crankshaft by carefully tightening the crank bolt. Once the Cramper is fully seated, we first torque the crank bolt to 66 pound-foot, back it off a smidge, retorque it to 37 pound-foot, then finally rotate the bolt another 90 degrees. We quickly reinstall the stock water pulley, and since these idlers are both looking pretty worn, we'll go ahead and replace them. So here we can see the massive difference in depth between the Mishimoto radiator and the stock one. This added depth comes from an extra column of cooling tubes inside the radiator. This increases coolant capacity and surface area for better heat dissipation. We drop the new radiator in, and while it's kind of a tight fit, everything seems to line up pretty well. We first attach the lower radiator hose, then transplant the studs from the stock radiator onto the new one. Once the AC condenser and the power steering cooling line are secured to the radiator, we can reinstall the upper brackets that hold the top of the condenser to the radiator. Then finally, all we have to do is put the hold down brackets back on, and we're good to move on to relocating the power steering reservoir. Now, the instructions call for moving the power steering reservoir from here to over here. But as you can tell, it's a pretty tight fit that will only be made worse once the cooling fan's reinstalled. So I'm thinking we tuck it here between the fender, fuse box, and windshield washer reservoir and run the hoses down around the PCM like this. We start by trimming a little bit of plastic off the reservoir to leave room for the washer neck, then remove about 1 inch from the provided relocation bracket and give it a new hole. We place the reservoir with its modified bracket into the desired area and move it around until we find an orientation we're happy with. Then we mark the spot where the bolt needs to go and drill a hole into the body. Now we can reattach the hoses to the reservoir, fish them through the engine bay, and secure the reservoir to the body with the help of a few washers. The reservoir sits snug and secure, the hoses don't have any extreme bends, and after some zip tying, I think this relocation came out pretty damn clean. Next, we need to install this provided adapter plate on the thermostat housing that repositions the upper radiator hose away from the supercharger. But unfortunately, this increases the height of the coolant outlet, causing it to come into contact with the intake manifold, which prevents the manifold from properly sitting on the cylinder heads, by kind of a lot. This wouldn't occur if this car had the stock intake manifold, but that manifold isn't optimized for boost, and this one just looks way better, so we're gonna have to get a little creative here.
It's time for you to put your thinking cap on.
I set the outlet on the crossover tube and clocked it to the required angle so I could see where and how much material I needed to remove from its tabs to make room for the bolts. On the fork side, I cut off the inner tab completely, and on the closed side, I removed about 1/5 of material in the shape of a slice. Next, we cut off about 2¼ inches from the upper radiator hose so we can attach the outlet to the provided steel coolant extension tube. But we're actually going to table this part for now, for reasons you'll understand later, and move on to installing the supercharger bracket, which can look a little challenging at first. But all we really need to worry about are these 3 holes. The 2 long bolts go through holes A and B, and the medium length bolt through hole C. The 2 long spacers pair with the 2 long bolts, and the shorter one goes over the shorter bolt. This is also where the additional idler will go, along with another spacer on the other side of it, and the inner bracket will ultimately sit like this. Back on the engine, we route the provided serpentine belt around the pulleys, as indicated by the instructions, and remove the 2 bolts from the driver's side idlers so we can install the pulley bracket spacers. We need to remove the bracket pulley for now so we can route the belt under it, and we also need to place this washer over the bolt that goes through the B hole. Now we can begin attaching the bracket to the engine. Once loosely in place, we can install the bracket pulley with the belt routed under it, along with another spacer and a very long chromated bolt at the far edge of the timing cover. Then after tightening up all the bolts, we take a moment to appreciate our bracket's dopeness. Next, we need to extend the mass airflow sensor wiring so its connector will be able to reach its new housing. We first remove its electrical tape and loom, then cut the cabling about 2 inches from the harness and strip the individual wires. To attach the provided wires to the MAF connector, I chose to use these solder sticks, which are essentially transparent heat shrink with a bit of solder in the middle. We use the same method to attach the extended MAF wiring to the harness, then wrap the wires in silicone tape and fresh loom for that clean OEM look. We're also going to replace the spark plugs with these ones from Brisk Racing. These plugs run cooler than stock, meaning they dissipate heat more quickly, which lowers the chances of detonation. Smaller gaps are less likely to be blown out by the increased cylinder pressures from the supercharger, so we'll gap them to a moderately tight 3/100 of an inch. To install them, all we have to do is pull out the coil packs, remove the current plugs, drop in the new ones, and torque them to 11 pound-foot plus 15 degrees. Okay, it's finally time to install the supercharger, but we need to make one quick modification to it first. We're going to remove this piece here, called the volute, and have it powder coated to match the fuel rails. The volute is first masked off to prevent powder from getting inside and on its mating surfaces. Then it's hung from an electrified rack that's grounded. As the gun expels the powder, it imparts a negative charge to the particles, causing them to cling to the volute, much like how hair clings to a balloon. So here we can see how it turned out, and while maybe the red clashes with the color of this table a bit, I promise once the head unit's on the engine, it's gonna look sick. I also got the throttle body elbow and the main bracket powder coated black to match the plastic piping, so this should all come together pretty nicely. Next, we need to attach the supercharger's oil drain line, which requires us to remove this stubbornly glued on 14mm plug. We set the 5 bolts that hold the supercharger to the bracket in their appropriate holes. Then we can finally mount the supercharger. The center bolt's by far the most difficult one to tighten, so hopefully you don't have those old man sausage fingers to contend with. We loop the belt around the supercharger pulley, rotate the tensioner, then slip the belt over the alternator. We check that the belt's properly seated on all the pulleys, and over here we can clearly see why it was necessary to remove that tab from the valve cover. Now we can return to that modified coolant neck from earlier. So I JB welded the cutoff pieces to the crossover pipe to ensure the oversized washers wouldn't clamp down at an angle. We bolt the manifold all the way down so we can check that the coolant extension tube doesn't come into contact with the idler or the belt. To achieve these clearances, which are about 3mm, I did have to slightly crush the metal tube in a vise. Now we're good to drop in the cooling fan, connect the radiator to the coolant tube with the remaining hose, and remount the coolant reservoir. Then before we install the intake manifold for real, we're going to relocate the intake air temp sensor to the manifold so we get super accurate readings. We first gently drill a 1/2-inch hole into the intake runner for cylinder 7, then use a 3/8 MPT tap to thread the hole, which allows us to screw in the sensor. We can see that the sensor is now well placed to pick up air temp data as it sits just a few inches in front of the combustion chamber. After blowing out all the plastic bits, we extend the 2 IAT wires that used to go to the mass airflow sensor to the independent IAT sensor. Then we can remove the tape from the intake ports, connect the IAT sensor, and bolt the manifold to the cylinder heads. Next up for reinstallation is the twin 62mm throttle body. We attach the provided elbow, slip the coupler onto the volute, and rotate the throttle body so we can secure it to the manifold. Then we attach the bypass valve to the outlet on the elbow with the valve pointed towards the driver's side headlight. But before we move on, we're going to get the injectors cleaned at Blazing Wrenches in Sparks, Nevada. The injectors are first tested prior to cleaning so we can measure any improvement in flow. Then they're soaked in a cleaning solution while being exposed to high-frequency sound waves to help break apart any buildup. The report shows that the injectors now flow about 10% more than before and have better spray patterns. This will not only ensure consistent combustion across cylinders, but slightly decrease load on the fuel pump. Which reminds me, we also need to upgrade the fuel system since we essentially just upgraded the air system. So what's special about this fuel pump is that it actually has 2 pumps, and since this kit is an OEM upgrade from the GT500, it also includes the harness and additional fuel pump module, making it a pretty straightforward install. We first release the clips under each of the back seats so we can remove them. Then we can pop off the rubber cap on the driver's side to gain access to the fuel hat. But there's not much room back here, so I'm going to drop the tank a little bit to make a little more room for my hands. Now we can hammer off the locking ring, disconnect the fuel line, and begin to pull the hat from the tank. Now it's a little hard to see, but there's actually a crossover tube that pulls gasoline from the other side of the saddle tank using the Venturi effect. Once that's disconnected, we can gently pull the assembly from the tank. With the old unit out of the way, we drop in the dual pump assembly with the fuel sender pointed towards the drive shaft. Don't forget to reconnect the crossover tube or you'll never be able to use more than half a tank of gas. And finally, we secure and seal the fuel pump assembly inside the tank by hammering the locking ring back into place. Next, we'll move on to the harness, which can look a little overwhelming. Like, where does all this wiring even go? We first mount the additional fuel pump module and the spare tire well to the already installed studs. Then we can plug in the 2 modules and connect the harness to the car's existing wiring by attaching the center connector on the harness to the cable that used to go to the driver's side module. The harness needs to be grounded in 2 different places, and luckily there's a ground just above each module. We punch a small hole in the spare tire well so we can mount the harness's only relay. Now normally to get power to the pumps, we would have to run the power line out under the trunk, underneath the side here, and up through the wheel well to the fuse box. But since I relocated my battery to the trunk, I don't have to worry about any of that and can easily piggyback onto a wire that runs directly to my battery's positive terminal. Back inside the car, we have to release the green and blue fuel sender wires from the 4-pin connector that used to go to the stock fuel hat. We first unlock the connector by pulling the blue centerpiece out, then use a pick tool to unseat the terminals so we can gently pull the wires from the connector. The green wire is then inserted into the right pin of the provided 2-pin connector. You'll hear a subtle click when the terminal seats, and the blue wire goes into the left pin. The last steps are to connect this to the harness, reattach the fuel line, and connect the harness to the fuel hat. But the way the harness sits once attached is far from ideal in my opinion, and all this bulky wiring is looking pretty amateur. So I decided to make an additional hole in the trunk that I could route the harness through so its connectors would arrive at the fuel hat from under the car. This removed that major kink in the harness and left the area under the back seats looking completely stock. Back in the engine bay, we can now reconnect all of the electrical connections and reattach the brake booster vacuum hose. We also need to hook up the vacuum hose that runs from the bypass valve to the fuel regulator hose so the valve can release excess compressed air when off throttle. After snipping the regulator hose in two, we insert the provided T-fitting, then trim the slack off the bypass line and attach. The very last steps are to install the cold side piping, including transplanting and connecting the MAF sensor, topping off the supercharger's oil, and installing its vented bolt so the head unit doesn't blow itself apart under load. Then finally, we can pour in some fresh engine oil, power steering fluid, and a few gallons of coolant. But before we actually start the car, we need to update the Mustang's tune with the fuel system configuration from an 07 to 09 GT500 since we just installed the fuel system from that car. I'm also going to remove a little bit of timing to be on the safe side.
If you want gasoline, that's great. Combustion.
So here we can clearly see the belt spinning the pulley, which in turn rotates the impeller, forcing air into the engine. The higher the engine revs, the more air that gets stuffed into the engine, enabling it to make more power. But I think it's time to answer the obvious question. How much horsepower does this engine make now? To find out, we're headed to Street to Sand in Reno, Nevada to get the Mustang dynoed and properly tuned. The owner has extensive experience tuning everything from off-road vehicles and Ferraris to anything LS powered in both my Viper and this Mustang more times than I can remember. So the most power this Mustang has ever made up until this point is 410 horsepower and 364 pound-foot of torque at the wheels. So these blue plots will act as our baseline today. Now I've already done a fair bit of street tuning to dial in the lower 2/3 of the MAF curve, but I'm purposely running the car rich in the upper RPMs to reduce the chances of detonation. My point is, our first dyno run will likely be nowhere near the Mustang's potential. On its first ever boosted dyno run, the supercharged Mustang was able to put down 530 horsepower and 429 pound-foot of torque at the wheels, which is a pretty decent bump above its best naturally aspirated numbers. But notice how the plots get pretty turbulent after about 5,500 RPM. This is because above that point, the engine is being fed about 5% more fuel than we're commanding. The knock sensors also picked up detonation, causing the PCM to automatically retard timing by as much as 5 degrees. But since we're only running 20 degrees of peak timing on high-ish octane gasoline, Dustin thinks the knock sensors are likely not actually hearing detonation, but instead irregular combustion, which can occur when too much fuel is present in the combustion chambers. So the first adjustment we're going to make is to lean out the engine with the goal of hitting an AFR of about 11.5 or 0.78 lambda. This time the Mustang was able to put down 581 wheel horsepower and 447 pound-foot of torque, a significant improvement from its previous run and well over baseline. And it appears Dustin was right. By just reducing fuel, the knock sensors didn't trigger and the PCM didn't reduce timing, allowing the engine to generate substantially more power. Now we're going to try advancing timing by just 1 degree above 3,000 RPM. But what does advancing timing even mean? Changing an engine's timing adjusts when the spark plugs ignite the air-fuel mixtures. Advancing timing means an earlier spark, while retarding timing means a later spark. Now, timing is measured in degrees of crankshaft rotation before top dead center. But all you need to understand is that advancing timing ignites the air-fuel mixture when the piston is at a lower point on the compression stroke. This allows more time for the combustion process to occur, which increases cylinder pressure and can result in a more efficient release of energy. A rough analogy is like pushing someone on a swing. If you time your push just right, you'll transfer more energy than if you push too early or too late. By advancing timing by 1 degree, the Mustang was able to put down an additional 4 horsepower, which is exactly what we'd like to see from this change. So now we'll repeat this process of advancing timing until the knock sensors detect actual detonation and/or the Mustang stops making more power. After a few iterations of this, the Mustang was ultimately able to put down 611 wheel horsepower and 459 pound-foot of torque on less than 10 pounds of boost. This is an increase of 200 wheel horsepower and 95 pound-foot of torque over its best naturally aspirated dyno run. Not too shabby considering we're running the biggest possible pulley on a non-intercooled setup, so there's still a good amount of power for us to tap into in the near future. But now it's time to find out if we've done enough for the Mustang to hang with the quickest and most powerful production Viper ever built. So all 5th gen Vipers are powered by these monster 8.4 liter V10s. But the 2015 model actually got a 5 horsepower bump, raising this Viper's output to 645 horsepower and 600 pound-foot of torque at the crank. This ridiculous power plant enables it to complete the quarter mile in under 11.5 seconds, making this Viper a hair quicker than a 2013 Corvette ZR1, a 2015 Challenger Hellcat, and a 2023 Tesla Model 3 Performance. And believe it or not, the Viper actually weighs over 200 pounds less than the Mustang, so I definitely have my work cut out for me. Now unfortunately, the Mustang has almost no traction in first gear anymore, so until I upgrade from these crappy 285 tires, we'll be starting races in second gear around 45 miles per hour. Mustang puts up a valiant effort, but by the top of 4th gear, it's undeniable it lost by at least half a car length. But before you dip out, let me show you something pretty cool. So the charts you see here show the data log from our race. Red is RPM, orange is intake air temperature, which comes from that sensor we installed in the manifold, white is spark advance, and teal is how many pounds of air the engine's going through per minute, but you don't really need to worry about that one. The race starts at this point on the charts and ends here. These spikes in RPM are when I shift from 2nd to 3rd and from 3rd to 4th. So now we'll watch the race again with the data log synced up, and as I row through the gears, keep an eye on the intake air temps. We can see that they're already over 130 degrees before the race even starts, which is pretty wild considering it's only 45 degrees outside. ChatGPT to estimate the horsepower loss from this dramatic increase in air temps, and it came up with a roughly 9% loss, or a reduction to around 540 wheel horsepower. But I've also programmed the PCM to pull timing when the IATs are above 140 degrees, so the Mustang's likely barely putting down 500 wheel horsepower by the time I shift into 4th gear. And this is exactly why the intercooler was invented, to significantly cool compressed air before going into the engine. So that's what we'll be installing in the next Mustang video, along with a smaller pulley and a wider wheel and tire setup to handle the Mustang's newfound power. Then we'll run this race back to see how much of a difference those mods make. As for the Viper, the spark plugs I installed in the last video were garbage, so it'll be getting a set of racing spark plugs from Brisk, just like the Mustang got in this video, along with new rockers from Harlan Sharp, which should further increase its horsepower. Then hopefully we'll find a few Corvettes to race.